I think rural electrification was very important because there was no other way that people were going to get electricity otherwise. With Interstate Power built a line to Shapville, and then they branched out. There was talk of them building down to our place, but it would have cost $1,000. And we were still in the middle of the Depression in 1935 in a small farm. So that was out. But then I can remember a couple of years later, my parents heard about this meeting in Elizabeth, and they went to it. And they were really excited and enthused when they got home because all we have to do is sign up and pay $5 and they'll build a line right to our place.
They had their first meeting in Elizabeth and my dad was there, and I think everybody was just happy to sign up. We lived close to Dubuque, Iowa, and they had electricity there, and they had it in East Dubuque and Galena. And they said, well, why can't we have it in the rural area?
You'd have to experience the old times to really appreciate what we got now, you know. As the REA started coming through, you know, I know my dad was talking about and wishing that it would hurry up and come down. They were down the road about 2-3 miles in the middle 40s. But I know we waited and was wishing it would come sooner.
Well, I think before we had electricity, it was the way of life, and we didn't think any different. We just done it that way. Our job was to carry the wood in every evening, and my mother had a cook stove and she baked bread. We grew our own vegetables in the garden, and we had our livestock to get our milk, and we had to milk the cows by hand twice a day. We had hogs, we got our meat. That was a big help to us during the Depression time.
Well, everything was done by hand. Wash time, you packed water in, hit the water, and a lot of washing was done on the scrub board. Yeah, it was a different situation.
We didn't have clothes that came without wrinkles. In those days, you ironed just about everything. Before my mom got the electric iron, and she had these, I guess they were made of cast iron, and it had a handle on it, and then you had a trivet that you could sit it on. But you would heat the one iron up and you'd use it, and then when it started to cool off, you'd always have two.
Bath night, when we were kids, the wash tub was filled with water during the day, and the water got warmed by the sun. And you took your bath after dark, and the youngest one got in first, and the oldest one was last.
Talking about bath night, I can recall one time when I was a small child. Back then we had Raleigh man would come around, and they had me in that, what we called the boiler for heating the water, taking a bath. Instead of getting me out and getting me dressed, they just put the lid on till the Raleigh man left.
When we moved to Muddy Hollow, we had 2 wells, no electricity, so you had to do all that pumping by hand for all your livestock and things like that. When I was growing up, I had so many things to do. I never even thought of electricity. My mother died in 1942. I was in the 8th grade. The first thing you get up in the morning, you put on your old clothes. You had to go out and help with the milk, and we milked about 20 cows. When we got about maybe 3/4 done, then I'd have to go in and start the cooking for the breakfast and stuff, and hoping that the cook stove was warm enough to cook the eggs and cook the coffee or make the coffee. So then you change your clothes again and you walk to school. Well, then as soon as school's out, you gotta hurry home, change your clothes again, and start the tours, you know. You had to be awful careful in the barn and stuff with the lantern, you know, with the dry straw and hay, that you didn't start a fire. Then when we got all the chores done, then we had to do our homework at night. We had 2 lamps. We had a regular oil lamp, then we had the Aladdin lamp, which is similar to the Coleman lantern today. We had the Zenith radio, the dry cell batteries. We always had to hurry up and get through milking so we could get in and listen to Jack Armstrong, the All-American Boy.
We had an ice man come through every week, put a chunk of ice in your ice box, which is the only thing we had to keep stuff cool.
We didn't have plumbing. You didn't have plumbing without any electricity. So of course you had an outside facility, and when the weather was cold, that wasn't exactly what you wanted to do.
We had a 2-story house on the farm. Bedrooms were all upstairs. And I can remember summers when it was so hot that we'd all sleep downstairs on the couch or the floor or wherever you could pick a place because it was just so hot upstairs, you couldn't stand it.
So I did grow up on a farm, and we had no electricity. It wasn't easy. Things were tough, so you got by with what you had and didn't complain. It was a hard thing to get electricity because if it wasn't for REA, utilities would charge so much a mile. and it was beyond their ability to pay to have a line brought into them. So with REA, they just became a member. They could get electricity.
But there was different people in the area that wanted the line, and they went around and talked to people, see if they would sign up, because everybody didn't sign up. Most of them wanted it, but there was a few that didn't, or they didn't afford it, or what, they didn't sign up to take it.
My father was instrumental in helping get Joe Carroll in this area. He became the first director of what was called District 1, and I know Dad went out and had people sign up, and I don't think he never got turned down. And it was only $5. Of course, $5 back then was quite a lot of money. Dad wanted electricity so bad, he had probably, I would say, it was almost like one of the first convenience stores. It was called Hilltop. He built his place back in 1929, before Highway 20 was even here. There was a series of batteries in the basement, and of course my father had a windmill outside, and it was providing a little electricity, but it was only enough for a couple of the coolers, one for soda and one for the beer. Of course, we only had a couple of electric lights upstairs, but when the electricity came, it was probably more of a benefit to my father and my mother, because they needed it awful bad.
Well, we really didn't think we were going to get it because we didn't own the farm we lived on. And it was a widow lady, so it was up to her to put the electricity in. Luckily, the neighbor lady was on the board of directors, Bernice Moore, and she was helpful in us getting electricity. I started to work the 25th of September in 1944 when I graduated that year. At that time, the office was in the same building as the post office. So we didn't have to go far to mail anything or get the mail. The manager when I started was Floyd Rubel, and then Chuck Futze was the line foreman, and Harry Ayler was working. I was assistant bookkeeper and stenographer. Alma Burlog had been the bookkeeper by herself for years, and she was getting married, so they had hired Alice Beesman. Well, then she needed help, so I was hired to help her. And that's how it all began. It was like a family. Everybody worked together, and everybody knew everybody, and the customers would come in and always had pleasant things to say. I started at $65 a month. And that, back then, I think I paid $5 a week for board and room. And it seemed like I always had money in my pocket. Those were the good old days.
My father was William F. Jansen. When I was in grade school in Carroll County, my dad helped take people around to get members signed up when they first started. Years later, in 1962, he was nominated on the board and served until '74. Back in those days, everybody in the farm community worked together, communicated with each other, they knew each other, and they tried to help out where they could. Jim Riley was one of the main guys that come down our area, and I think Dad knew most of the other linemen and that too.
Some of the pioneer linemen, I'm sure they had a difficult time. They virtually had to raise every pole, I guess, by hand, but there was always that farmer out there that you need a helping hand, and they would help them raise these poles, and probably ready to do anything, carry stuff, and they were so happy to get the electricity, I'm sure.
Later on, Chuck Futze got to be the manager, and that's when the rest of us farmers got our electricity.
Well, back in them days, you know, when they first started out, they had to run miles and miles the line for these farmers. That was a big thing because, you know, they milked and everything, and when they would get their power, they think they were in heaven, you know.
I don't remember we ever saw the surveyors, but all at once there were little stakes out in the pastures and writing on them, and that's where the poles went. And pretty soon the crew came through with their big long-handled shovels and picks and digging holes. In some places they had to use a little dynamite where they hit solid rock. And I don't remember them bringing the poles in, but I can remember seeing the guys set a pole. You know, there's enough of them there, they'd get underneath it and pick it up, and then there's two guys with long poles with spikes in the end, and they just push her up by hand.
Back in them days, it was all setting poles by hand. They had no digger trucks, they didn't have no bucket trucks, everything was hard work back in them days.
Jim Riley, I rode with him mostly, because Harry Ayler was foreman, and Jim Riley was the main man that taught me how to do things and how to work. I mean, you started with a shovel first and got your hole down so far, and the deeper you got, of course, you had to have the longer shovels, and that's where these spade and spoon come along. You'd loosen it up with the spade and then dig it out with the spoon.
In 1943, my folks got their first electricity. Joe Carroll come through at that time. I remember Harry Ayler and I believe Lloyd Price was one of them. They was great guys, they knew what to do, and they had to dig the holes all by hand and set the poles with sticks. It didn't take them long either. They was an excellent crew, they did it all.
I can recall in '39 when the neighbors got electricity and they had portable generators set up where they got Galena Oaks out here now between here and Woodbine. The reason they had two of them there was if one would quit on, they could use the other one to keep the electricity going. And the thing I recall back then, if you turned the lights on, they would dim.
Bobby Wan from Mount Carroll used to run the diesel-powered generator that fed the first system south, and he maintained the generators at Woodbine. And that was a long ways to feed a single-phase line, clear to Chadwick.
Yeah, it was quite an experience to have those poles set and big transformer up on the pole and stringing the wires and things. It was quite an operation.
I remember when the guys came to bring the electricity, this big man, and he may not have been so big because I was just a kid, but this big tall guy with a great big coil of wire over his shoulder walked down through the yard, and it was quite exciting.
You know, I can remember as a kid, just a small kid when we got electricity. And I can remember my dad digging poles, you know, digging the holes for the poles to come in. So REA has always been a big factor in my life, you know. It was a wonderful program. It opened up the rural area, you know, and you just can't say enough good about what REA has done over the years, you know.
We always called it the co-op, or you called it REA. We never called it Joe Carroll. It was REA. That was what all the country people called it. Well, I was about 7 or 8 years old when we got the electric power. We didn't get the electric power as early as a lot of people in our area because where we were at, for some reason, they didn't put the power in, and then the war came. So all of the copper and things that went into the war effort were no longer used for electricity, so we didn't get it. For that year, for Christmas, after we got electricity, my mother got an electric iron. Very pleased to get an electric iron. Today's woman wouldn't be too pleased with that, but she was because she didn't have something like that as it was.
Well, knowing that other people had electricity and we didn't have it, it really didn't bother me because we never knew never had that opportunity to have it easy like that. When electricity came in 1948, it was hard to get used to these new types of things because you were so used to doing it the other way. I remember when the electricians came to wire the house, and of course that was kind of exciting because then we knew that eventually we wouldn't have to use the kerosene lamp. I think the best thing of having electricity in the rural area is what it does for the farmer, that he can have electric motors, electric lights, and electric fans, and all these different things that he needs in his operation of farming. One of the most exciting things was that we could have an electric motor on the engine that pumped the water for the cattle.
Well, it was a big change because we used to have an old light plant in the basement that only run about half the time. We was always trying to get parts for it and couldn't get parts for it. When REA come, we could get lights out in the outer buildings. Before, all we had was a light bulb in the kitchen and maybe one in the bedroom, and that was all the lights we had. Then we pumped our water with electricity. Before, we always had a gasoline motor on the well. It was a great improvement. I mean, at nighttime and early in the morning, you could turn the light on and see where you was going, and it made it nice.
Everybody was happy to get it when REA when it come through, because they waited for years for the electricity. It was just so much more convenient. But before that, flashlights and oil lamps is just the way of life.
I'll never forget, we go on inside and they could turn that switch on and that would light up, that 300 watt bulb would light up that whole barnyard. And Mom could get a refrigerator. We didn't have to drag home ice.
And they really didn't think they'd need 40 kilowatts. They thought that was too much. And it wasn't long until they needed so much more, when they found out how good it was and how easy things were.
We had some wonderful board members. Everybody came from a little bit different background. I mean, most of them were farmers. My father had a particularly good friend, Morris Birkbeck. Of course, Morris had polio when he was young, and he always walked with a cane. He also represented Joe Carroll on the Darrellin Power Board, and he never could get around very well, but he liked to go to the national conventions. And of course, my father did, and they both loved train rides. So every convention they went to, it was always on the train.
Everett Reed was a director, and E.L. Dauphin from Savannah. You just got to know everybody and you enjoyed going to work. But every week or month, we added new members as fast as they could build lines, because everybody was wanting it then. And we had to have a surveyor come and do all that work ahead of building. So it took a lot of preparation. They started really putting up a lot of lines, and so they had to keep hiring more help. Being wartime, it was a little hard to get material, so sometimes we'd have to postpone a line to wait until we got everything we needed to go on and build, and get easements to go over people's land, and because some people weren't as friendly, about that.
I remember one party, and I'm not going to say what part of the country it was, he didn't want it at all. And they set a pole somewhere close to his property, and he went out with the axe and was going to chop it down. He didn't want it that bad. But the line went through, but I don't know what they did to him to convince him that it was a good thing.
I started working at Joe Carroll in 1958. Alice Beesman was the bookkeeper, and she had been there for years. Hazel Morrison also worked there. Chuck McClave used to work inside, and he would add up the boys' hours. Chuck Utze was the boss at that time. He was always easy to get along with, and he had been one of the boys. He had come up being a lineman. He understood what it took to put that electricity in.
Joe Carroll was built right in the limestone area all the way up through there, so you only had maybe 2 foot of actual soil. So every time you dug a hole, you either had to blast it or just grind and grind and grind to get it down. And the guys did a wonderful job. I mean, it was hard work.
Of course, there were places where there were open fields and that weren't hard. But there were other places where they come up over the side of a hill and they had to cut a great many trees down in order to put those lines through. Most of the people that we were dealing with were people who were glad to get the power. When they first started out years ago, nobody thought the country people would use enough electricity to make it worthwhile. And of course that was proved very wrong.
Back then you got to know an awful lot of the members, and you looked forward to meeting them and chatting with them a little bit. One time when we were doing disconnects, it was a single mom with a bunch of little kids. She couldn't pay her light bill. It was winter. Jim Riley went down there to disconnect her, and when he seen all them little kids, he didn't disconnect her. He came back and he paid the bill out of his pocket. That's the kind of a guy Jim Riley was.
When the co-ops first started, they was primarily all farmers, all rural areas. And then they had the housing projects come up.
There were a few things getting started, Apple Canyon Lake, and then we started getting some electric heat. That was a little different. Chestnut was a big account for us. That came in those early years of the 60s as well.
The electricity provided the lifts for the skiers, for the recreation. Everybody likes recreation, and this was a big help in the community at that time.
Gary Stuva came behind Chuck Utze. You really looked forward to coming to work for Gary. He was a joy to be around.
I started in 1981. When I took over at Joe Carroll, we were operating out of a small building, not enough room to do anything. We talked with the REA rep, and REA said they were going to stop making headquarter loans. But would we like to put in for a headquarter loan? They could see the need. Of course, we could see the need also. That was the thing that needed to be done. The board met, and we decided we would pursue that. Sheridan Valley at Albia had just built a new headquarters, and we liked their plans, and they give us their plans. We took them, we revised them, and had an architect put it together, an engineer. REA rep told us if you'd take that into Washington, that would be a lot better. Walk it in, take it to the agriculture department, take it to REA, and that's what we did. We met with them, and they did issue, I think, one of the last headquarter loans that was made for electric cooperative at that time. We really had a diversified load. I mean, we really did. And it was a big change when we went into the Galena territory. That was just a different ball game. It was all limestone. So anything you did was a major undertaking. They wanted everything underground. They wanted nothing showing. It was a lot of work for a lineman. I mean, that was hard work.
It was tough. You had to really be careful. Safety was always a high priority, and I loved it. I mean, to be there 43 years, I guess you'd have to like your job.
I enjoyed working here. I mean, it was a good, fulfilling job. The biggest change was when we got all the hydraulics and hydraulic bucket trucks. It was such a help in storms, and it was more reliable to get out there and get the job done quicker than when you had to do it by hand.
You know, a lineman, he's got to be such a dedicated person, because we know that the lights only go out when there's a storm or a snowfall, and the way the terrain around here, it's impossible almost to get around. Sometimes they can't even get the vehicles back to where the lines are, and they virtually got to carry everything back, and they've got to climb these poles in the cold weather, and most of the time the lights aren't out very long at all.
I think the linemen don't get near the credit they should. They go out in the worst weather, the lightning, the wind, the storms, the snow, and they do a wonderful job of it, just because they love it.
When you get a job completed and back restored to the way it was, it gives you good satisfaction that you've done your job.
Joe Carroll did have one of the best board of directors. Some of them were older farmers, you know, and sometimes they get set in their ways, but they were progressive. They were older directors who had came up with that cooperative, but they could see and they had a vision, and they were easy to work with. They accepted the city people coming in and building in the area because they could see what it did for our load and how prosperous Joe Carroll really was.
Gary did hire Connie Shireman as his assistant, and then later on he recommended her to be general manager of Joe Carroll, and she was.
The opportunity came here at Joe Carroll Energy when I got a call from the then board chairman who said that the co-op needed help with this acquisition that they were doing, the acquisition of Interstate Power and Light Service territory. The acquisition brought some new challenges, which for Joe Carroll Energy included serving some communities that we never did before. That includes Galena, Illinois, and Savannah, Illinois. We overnight tripled in size, almost quadrupled our electric load, and for the first time picked up natural gas load in the southern part of our system. One of the great opportunities that Joe Carroll Energy had was to pick up some large industrial electric and natural gas members. That has been a good experience for the co-op. Joe Carroll Energy did get involved in the wireless internet business a few years ago. We had a majority of our members who either didn't have internet access at all or had dial-up. So we decided, with it being a very important thing for our members, to take a good strong look at that. And at the same time, the co-op was looking at some new technologies that would really help us communicate better with our substations and gas mains to be able to keep an eye on the expensive equipment that we have in those places. We soon discovered the technology to communicate with those substations, with those gas mains, is the same, to provide wireless broadband internet service to our members. And so we really felt it was a win-win to take a look at providing that service to our members that needed it while we were using the same technology to help the co-op. We were very pleased to merge with Farmers Mutual Electric Company in April of 2013. Farmers Mutual had its own proud history as the oldest cooperative in Illinois and did a great job of providing electric service to their members for many, many decades. The great thing about the merger with Farmers Mutual is now we have a bunch of new members who understand the co-op program. It's just been a really good fit for Joe Carroll Energy and Farmers Mutual Electric Company coming together.
Being a member of electric cooperative means that I've got some say-so about what goes on. I can vote at the annual meeting. To be truthful, to get better service.
When you become a member of Joe Carroll, you're actually an owner of that co-op. It's a benefit to everybody.
You've got a voice in what goes on. ComEd customers, they can complain, but it doesn't do much good. But here, they sit down, they listen to you. They understand your hurts and your wishes.
We always enjoyed going to the Joe Carroll annual meetings. Yeah, we never missed a meeting. For one thing, they give you a lunch.
And that was delicious.
Well, I don't think if it would have been for the REAs, the Rural Electrification Program, there'd still be people without lights. It was a very good program, and I think it benefited the country real well.
I look back at the years at Joe Carroll were some of the best years of my life. They really were. Sometimes you don't know what you have until you leave it, I guess.
I just like coming to work and being with the people. It was just a joy to come to work to see your friends.
You can't say enough about the lights coming out to the country. It was nice to see, and it brightened up the country, it did.
People are so dependent on electricity today that there's nothing you could do without it.
There's so many advantages and helps that I sure wouldn't want to do without it.